All right, so Donald Trump back in the White House.
Yeah.
Can you believe this? I mean, seriously, remember election night? It felt like the world just kind of flipped upside down.
Yeah, it is pretty remarkable. I mean, just the fact that a former president, and a convicted felon at that is back in the White House, that's something we haven't really seen in modern American history.
It really makes you think, how did he manage to pull this off? After January 6th, Trump was practically a pariah. Even his own party seemed ready to move on.
Well, that's what makes it so fascinating, right? You'd think the indictments, all four of them, the election interference, the hush money payments, you'd think that'd be the end for any political campaign. But for Trump, it kind of became this rallying cry.
So it's like all those legal troubles actually ended up energizing his supporters.
Exactly. They managed to frame the indictments as political persecution, and it really resonated with his base. They saw him as the victim of this corrupt system, kind of a martyr fighting for them. And remember, that $34.8 million he raised after the New York conviction, that wasn't just money, it was a symbol.
Yeah, a symbol of defiance against what they saw as an unjust attack.
Right, and so instead of turning away from him, his supporters just dug in even deeper.
It created that us versus them dynamic that kind of fueled his whole campaign. And this time around, Trump's campaign was surprisingly organized and strategic. It wasn't all rallies and crazy tweets anymore. They were laser-focused on one group in particular, the persuadables, those undecided voters who could swing the election.
Yeah, they really targeted those who could go either way.
Like those viral videos of Trump handing out food. That wasn't just a photo op, was it?
No, not at all. It was targeted outreach aimed at specific voter groups in those key swing states. They knew exactly who they needed to win over and tailored their message accordingly.
Okay, so while Trump's team was busy winning over those persuadables, Biden was dealing with his age becoming a real concern for some voters. And then there was that debate.
Oh yeah, the one where Biden seemed to agree with Trump's claim about beating Medicare. It was a huge blunder that played right into Trump's hands. He was able to paint Biden as out of touch and incapable, reinforce that narrative that it was time for a change.
It felt like a turning point, for sure. Like the momentum swung hard in Trump's direction.
Yeah.
I can only imagine what Biden's campaign was thinking watching that unfold.
Oh, I'm sure it was a major setback. And while Biden was facing those challenges, the initial enthusiasm for him didn't seem to translate over to Kamala Harris.
And Trump was quick to exploit that, wasn't he?
Absolutely. He portrayed her as part of the failing establishment, the embodiment of the status quo that a lot of voters were just desperate to change. He even attacked her identity, questioning her heritage and suggesting that she wasn't black enough.
Those were some pretty divisive tactics, but they worked on his base.
They did. And then there was the issue of immigration, a topic Trump has always known how to use to his advantage. He hammered home that message that the border was in chaos and that the Biden administration was failing to protect Americans.
Yeah. I remember those stories he would tell at his rallies about migrants eating dogs and cats.
Yeah.
I mean, whether they were true or not, those stories really tapped into a deep well of anxiety and fear.
It was a potent mix, fear-mongering and the promise of a strong leader. He offered simple solutions to very complicated problems. And for voters who felt ignored and left behind, it was a message that really hit home.
So we've got Trump re-energizing his base by turning his legal battles into a badge of honor, strategically targeting persuadable voters, and exploiting Biden's weaknesses and the anxieties surrounding immigration. It seems like a perfect storm, but I'm sure there's more to it than that, right?
Oh, definitely. There's always more to the story.
Oh, the guy.
There's always more to the story. If you think back to Trump's earlier campaigns, they were known for their chaotic energy, lots of rallies and tweets. It was like a whirlwind.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Well, this time it was different, more organized. The ground game was much more strategic. They were knocking on doors, holding targeted events. They even out-hustled the Democrats in some areas, which is almost unheard of.
So they realized that this time, it wasn't enough to just rely on those big rallies and those attention-grabbing tweets.
That's right. They had to actually convince people, you know?
Especially those undecided voters, those persuadables we were talking about. Makes sense. So a more organized ground game, a focus on immigration. What else contributed to this surprising victory?
Well, let's not forget about the Republican primaries. It's kind of ironic, but those indictments that seemed so damaging actually ended up helping Trump solidify his support within the party.
Because any attack on Trump was seen as an attack on the Republican Party itself.
Exactly. His rivals in the primary were practically tripping over themselves to defend him, weaponized DOJ, political witch hunt, that sort of thing. It created this feeling that the establishment was out to get him, and by extension, anyone who supported him.
So those legal challenges, instead of weakening him, they actually made him stronger within the party.
In a way, yes. It rallied the base and made any criticism of him seem like a betrayal. It really shows you the power of narrative and how effectively they were able to frame the whole situation.
Wow, that's quite a twist. Looking at the other side, do you think there's anything the Democrats could have done differently?
Well, it's always easier to look back and say what they should have done. But it does seem like they might have underestimated the power of Trump's narrative. They spent a lot of time focusing on his flaws, his
Yeah.
scandals.
And let's be honest, there were a lot of them.
Oh, there were. But by focusing on those things, they kind of played right into his hands. It allowed him to position himself as the outsider, the victim, fighting against a corrupt system.
So they were actually reinforcing the very image he was trying to project.
It's possible. Maybe they would have been more effective if they had focused on a more positive message, their own plans and policies, instead of getting dragged into the mud with Trump.
So focusing on a hopeful, forward-looking message instead of just attacking Trump. Interesting. Did the media play a role in all of this as well?
Oh, I think the media's role is undeniable, especially certain outlets. They gave Trump an enormous platform, even when he was spreading misinformation or making outrageous statements. They couldn't resist the spectacle, the controversy.
And the ratings that came with it.
Right. And every time they covered him, even if it was to criticize him, it just amplified his message. It gave him more oxygen.
So even though they were often critical of him, they were still contributing to his rise.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that they helped to normalize his behavior to make his rhetoric more acceptable, even to people who might have otherwise rejected it.
That's a pretty depressing thought. Okay, we've talked about Trump's strategy, the Democrats' missteps, the media's influence, but at the end of the day, it all comes down to the voters. What do you think it was about Trump's message that resonated so deeply with so many Americans?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think for a lot of people, it was a sense of grievance, a feeling that the system wasn't working for them. They were tired of the status quo, tired of the political elites.
And they saw Trump as the ultimate anti-establishment candidate, someone who would shake things up.
Exactly. He promised to drain the swamp to fight for the forgotten man. And for a lot of people, that message, however simplistic or unrealistic it might have been, was incredibly appealing.
It's like he was able to tap into this deep well of anger and frustration and turn it into a powerful political movement.
Precisely. And he was incredibly skilled at exploiting those emotions, at turning them into votes.
It's amazing that even though he's a billionaire businessman, he was able to convince working-class Americans that he understood their struggles, that he was one of them.
Yeah, that's the paradox of Trump. He's a master manipulator, but he's also incredibly gifted at connecting with people on an emotional level. He makes them feel seen, heard, even if it's all an illusion.
It's a powerful illusion, though, clearly.
Yeah.
But it's also a dangerous one, right? Because it's based on such negative emotions like anger and resentment and fear.
Absolutely. And those emotions can be very destructive, especially when they're being skillfully manipulated.
So here we are with Trump back in the White House. What does this all mean for the future of America?
That's the big question we all have to grapple with now. This election wasn't just about Trump. It was about a deeply divided America.
Yeah.
A country struggling with its identity and its place in the world.
It's like the election was a mirror, reflecting back all of our anxieties and our fears.
You got it. And what we see in that reflection should give us all pause, because this election wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. And what that chapter holds is still very much unwritten.
That's a pretty sobering thought. But I guess it's ultimately up to us, the citizens, to decide what kind of future we want to create.
That's the power and the responsibility we all have. We can choose to be consumed by anger and division, or we could choose to build a better, more compassionate society.
It's a choice we all have to make every single day. And the consequences of that choice will shape the future of our country and the world.
Yeah.
It really does feel like we're at a crossroads. It's like this election showed us just how vulnerable we are to those strongman tactics, those promises of simple solutions to really complicated problems.
Right. And it's easy to get caught up in those promises, especially when you have someone like Trump who's so good at tapping into our fears and frustrations. But we can't just let those emotions control us. We have to be more careful, more critical in the way we think.
I agree, but that's easier said than done. It feels like everywhere you look, there's someone yelling their opinion. It's hard to even know what to believe anymore. So what can we do? Like as individuals, how do we navigate this whole mess?
Well, I think it starts with being aware of those tactics,
Yeah.
those attempts to manipulate our emotions. We can't just sit back and observe information anymore. We have to be more active, question what we see and hear, and really analyze where it's coming from, what the agenda might be.
So like fact-checking, doing our own research, being skeptical of those easy answers.
Exactly. And being willing to, have real conversations with people who see things differently. It's not about winning an argument or proving someone wrong. It's about trying to understand different perspectives and finding common ground even when it seems impossible.
Which is so hard these days. It seems like everyone's stuck in their own echo chambers, surrounded by people who already agree with them.
It is a challenge for sure, but it's more important now than ever because if we can't even talk to each other, if we can't find those points of connection, we're just going to keep making the same mistakes, falling for the same empty promises.
So you're saying this election wasn't just about Trump. It was about all of us. It's about the choices we make, the information we consume, the way we treat each other.
You got it. Trump might have won this round, but the future of America isn't set in stone. It's still being written, and we all have a hand in shaping what that future looks like.
That's kind of empowering, but also a little scary. It's a lot of responsibility. So any final thoughts for our listeners before we wrap things up?
I think this election was a wake-up call. It showed us the cracks in our society, how fragile our democracy really is. So the question is, what are we going to do with that knowledge? Are we going to let fear and division win, or are we going to rise to the challenge and build a better future, a more resilient future? That's the question I'll leave you with.
It's a heavy question, but a really important one. Thanks for diving deep with us today, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into, well, whatever the world throws at us next. Until then, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep asking those tough questions.